I'm now going to introduce our third and final panelist, Professor Walter Kalin, Professor at the University of Bern, well known to many of us as the former representative on internally displaced persons, as well as a former member of the Human Rights Committee. Also, over to you.
Thanks. First, my sincere thanks for having been invited to this panel on improving implementation and follow-up. Unfortunately, I was not able to be here yesterday, so I don't know whether you had any discussion on what implementation actually means. For me, the core of implementation is positive impact on the ability to ensure human rights for real people in real situations. So implementation is not its only first step towards implementation if the state, for instance, accepts a recommendation. And accountability, that's when implementation fails. My remarks are based on this understanding of implementation, and I have three hypotheses I would like to present here. The first one is, if we understand implementation in this way, then we have to realize that implementation does not happen in Geneva. The second hypothesis will be implementation does not happen automatically at the domestic level. And the third is implementation does not happen unless there is follow-up at the Geneva level. So I will close the circle. Implementation does not happen in Geneva. Why? My last official mission was to Iraq, and I spent several days in the so-called green zone, the international zone, and I must say it was quite a unique experience. It reminded me somehow of Star Trek, not only because the now ruined, destroyed buildings and monuments built by Saddam Hussein could be out of a Hollywood movie, but also because it's like a base on planet 2 Delta X. People staying there, not moving out, very few move out. It's dangerous. Those who venture out use these strange, huge vehicles with big antennas and have to put on special gear to protect against the hostile environment. Sometimes, I must say, Geneva reminds me a little bit of a green zone. Because, for instance, when I was sitting on the podium as representative of the Secretary General on Internally Displaced Persons, presenting my country mission reports, I felt that my recommendations somehow were evaporating like smoke under the beautiful ceiling in that big meeting room. And please do not take any offense, colleagues from the diplomatic community. It's simply because you are reporting to ministries of foreign affairs and not to the Ministry of all affairs domestic. Implementation has to happen at the domestic level. With the treaty bodies, it's a little bit better, I felt, when I was sitting on the Human Rights Committee, because, not always, but when there was a good, competent delegation with representatives of the authorities concerned, the judiciary, key ministries, sometimes I felt, well, these persons really, through the dialogue, have learned something, and they're going back maybe with some second thoughts on what they had to say when they simply had to defend their country position. And the UPR is still a bit better, because here countries are formally expected to make a clear declaration on what recommendations they accept. But as I had said, this is a first step towards implementation. It's not implementation. So implementation at the country level does not happen automatically. Of course it doesn't happen automatically, but what are the obstacles? I think it's basically, and I simplify three: lack of knowledge. Geneva is as far away as planet 2 Delta X for the authorities, the domestic authorities, the representatives of the government at the district level, the grassroots organizations, not in all, but in many, many countries. We are not very good at disseminating our information, and mechanisms in country are not often very good at really making that dissemination happen. second obstacle, of course, is lack of political will. And it's a serious obstacle in many countries, and lack of political will can have many different reasons. It can be bad will, but it can also be political constraints. It can be different priorities the government has. So we shouldn't be naive about the issue of political will and the complexities of getting the political will. And the third element, of course, is lack of capacity. Lack of capacity at the institutional level, lack of capacity in terms of lack of resources, human resources, financial resources, and again, it's very, very complex. So what should we do about it? We did refer to the fifth pillar, everything else than the human rights mechanisms. And Bertie Ramcharan mentioned the huge importance of what's happening at the country level, the country team, and I simply can repeat what he said, but I'm going to repeat it so maybe it sticks in your minds. It's really there where things are going to happen. It is the country team that needs to be on board. And not just because they get the letter, these are the recommendations, because there is a discussion with the different components of the country team on what the priorities are, how the recommendations, for instance, of a treaty body or after a special rapporteur's visit can influence, should influence their own planning, be it within the framework of the UNDAS, the development activities frameworks, be it in the activities of humanitarian agencies, all the different planning. And I would say, maybe not all, but 80% of the Human Rights Council mandates are very, very relevant, at least for one, very often for several UN agencies. But it's not only the UN team that needs to be on board. It's also, for instance, and they play a very important role, the national human rights institutions. The Public Defender of Georgia gave this morning to me this report on the situation of internally displaced persons, IDPs in Georgia, January to July 2010. And I was very happy to see, I was not able to read the whole report, but just looking at the footnotes, he's referring to special procedures mandates, to Milou Kotari's visit, to my recommendations. That's follow-up. And very much the reporting is based on these international criteria. An excellent, good example of what can happen at the country level. And I know he is a man that is not hiding, that is provoking discussions, and it's good discussions in your country, because it's exactly that's what we need in terms of making recommendations happen and being implemented. It's the NGOs, it's academia. Donors are very important. My own experience is where I had some success in terms of implementation, very often it was because I was able to bring the donors together, and despite very different interests on these issues, they agreed. And I failed very often because donors did not have a consensus and sent out very mixed messages to the government. So working with donors, again, on specific recommendations, it's important. And then, of course, the government counterparts, the judiciary, members of parliament. And a very good experience a few months ago in Central African Republic, where it was members of parliament who finally made it happen, that the government is starting to draft legislation, prepare legislation on internally displaced persons. So many, many things that can happen here. At the country level means also bringing it back to the headquarters level. The headquarters level of the UN organizations, and Bertie also mentioned it.